Ever tried soldering a copper pipe only to turn the water back on and find a drip coming from your joint? Maybe the process of soldering copper pipe from start to finish, and I mean every single detail. We are going to cover preparation, the actual soldering technique, and how to finish your joint the right way. Plus, stick around to the end, where I will show you a simple test you can do to guarantee your joint is perfect before you ever turn the water back on. Let us get into it. Soldering copper pipe is one of those skills that separates a confident homeowner from someone who dreads every plumbing repair. And the truth is, once you understand how it works and why each step matters, you will be able to tackle any copper joint in your home with complete peace of mind. So, let me start by walking you through the tools and materials you are going to need. First up is your torch. Now, you do not need anything fancy here. A basic handheld torch from your local hardware store will run you somewhere between $20 and $50, and that is plenty for any residential work. The more expensive professional models are nice, but honestly, for the kind of soldering you will be doing around the house, a standard torch works perfectly fine. I have used the same $25 torch on dozens of jobs and never had an issue. Now, to fuel that torch, you have got two options. The first is regular propane gas, and you have probably seen these canisters before. They are the same ones people use for camping stoves. You can find them in the camping section or the plumbing aisle at any hardware store. Your second option is MAP gas, and that is spelled M-A-P. MAP gas burns hotter than propane, which means it heats up your joint faster. For most half-inch and three-quarter-inch residential pipes, propane works just fine. But if you are working with 1-inch pipe or larger, or if you just want to speed things up a bit, MAP gas is worth the extra few dollars. Personally, I keep both on hand and grab whichever one makes sense for the job. Next, you need a way to light your torch. Some torches come with a built-in igniter, which is convenient. But if yours does not have one, you can either buy a dedicated striker, which is that little metal device that creates a spark, or you can just use a regular lighter. I will be honest with you, I have used a $1 lighter for years, and it works perfectly fine. No need to overthink this one. Now, let us talk about cleaning supplies. And this is where a lot of people cut corners and end up with leaky joints. You are going to need either sandpaper or emery cloth for cleaning the outside of your pipe. I prefer emery cloth because it is a little more flexible and wraps around the pipe nicely. Look for something around 120 grit or 150 grit. For the inside of your fittings, you will need wire brushes to match your pipe. So if you are working with half-inch pipe, get a half-inch brush. 3/4-inch pipe, get a 3/4-inch brush. These brushes have stiff bristles that clean the inside of the fitting and rough up the surface just enough for the solder to grip properly. You are also going to need soldering flux, sometimes called paste. This stuff is absolutely essential. Flux does a couple of important things. It prevents the copper from oxidizing when you heat it up, and it helps the solder flow into the joint. Without flux, your solder will just ball up and sit on the surface instead of flowing where it needs to go. Trust me on this one. I have seen people try to solder without flux, and it simply does not work. And finally, you need solder. Now, here is something really important. For any water lines in your home, you must use lead-free solder. It is also called 95-5 solder because it is 95% tin and 5% antimony. This is code requirement for potable water lines, meaning any pipe that carries water you might drink or cook with. There is also 50-50 solder, which contains lead, but that is only for drain lines, where the water will never be consumed. For this video, we are focusing on lead-free solder since that is what you will use for almost every residential repair. All right, now that we have got our tools and materials together, let us talk about the most important part of this entire process, and that is preparation. I cannot stress this enough. Preparation is the secret to getting a leak-free joint every single time. If you rush through this step or skip any part of it, you are almost guaranteed to end up with a drip. And a dripping joint behind a wall can cause thousands of dollars in water damage before you even notice it. So please, take your time here. The first thing you need to do is clean the outside of your pipe. Take your emery cloth or sandpaper and wrap it around the section of pipe that is going to slide into the fitting. Now, rub it back and forth while rotating the cloth around the pipe. You want to keep doing this until the copper looks bright and shiny, almost like a brand new penny. What you're doing is removing any oxidation, dirt, fingerprints, or surface corrosion that has built up over time. Even a new piece of pipe from the hardware store needs to be cleaned because it has been sitting on a shelf collecting dust and oils from people handling it. Here is a good visual cue to know when you are done. When you started, the pipe probably had some dull spots, maybe some greenish discoloration or dark patches. After cleaning, it should be uniformly bright and shiny with no spots or streaks. If you can still see any discoloration, keep sanding. I usually spend about 15 to 20 seconds on each pipe end, and I make sure to clean about an inch past where the fitting will sit, just to be safe. Now, let us clean the inside of your fitting. Grab the appropriately sized wire brush and insert it into the fitting opening. Twist it back and forth while pushing in and pulling out. You want to do this maybe 10 or 15 times until the inside surface is roughed up and shiny. Now, most fittings come from the manufacturer already pretty clean. But here is the thing. The solder needs something to grip onto, and that slightly roughed up surface gives it the texture it needs to create a strong bond. So even if your fitting looks clean, always hit it with the brush. One tip I learned from an old-timer years ago. If you're doing a big job with lots of fittings to clean, you can cut the handle off one of those wire brushes and chuck it into a cordless drill. Then you just insert it into each fitting and give it a quick spin. It cleans the fitting in about 2 seconds and saves your wrist from all that twisting. Great trick if you are sweating in 10 or 15 joints at once. Now, here is something critical. Once your pipe and fitting are clean, do not touch the clean surfaces with your bare hands. The oils from your skin can contaminate the copper and cause problems when you solder. If you need to set them down, place them on a clean rag and try to assemble everything within a few minutes of cleaning before any new oxidation can form. With both surfaces now prepped and shiny, it's time to apply the flux. Open up your container of flux and you will see it has a paste-like consistency, kind of like petroleum jelly, but grittier. Using the brush that comes with most flux containers, or a small acid brush, if yours did not include one, apply a thin, even coat of flux to the outside of the pipe. Cover the entire area that will be inside the fitting. Then apply flux to the inside of the fitting as well. You want both mating surfaces completely covered, but you do not need to glob it on. A nice thin coat is all it takes. Once your flux is applied, slide the pipe into the fitting and give it a little twist back and forth. This helps spread the flux evenly and ensures you have got good coverage on both surfaces. Push the pipe all the way into the fitting until it bottoms out. You should feel it stop when it hits the internal shoulder of the fitting. That full insertion is important because it gives you the maximum surface area for your solder to bond. By the way, if you are finding this helpful so far, take a second to subscribe so you do not miss future videos like this one. All right, let us keep going. Now, we are ready for the actual soldering. And this is where understanding a little bit of science really helps you out. When you heat up a properly fluxed copper joint and touch solder to it, something pretty amazing happens. The solder gets pulled into the joint all by itself, even flowing upward against gravity. This is called capillary action. Capillary action is the ability of a liquid to flow through narrow spaces without any outside force pushing it. The gap between your pipe and fitting is so small that the molten solder gets drawn right in and fills the entire joint. Pretty neat, right? But here's the key. You need to heat the joint correctly for capillary action to work its magic. And this is where I see a lot of people make mistakes. The goal is to heat the fitting, not the pipe, and to start from the bottom and work your way up. Let me explain why both of these things matter. First, why heat the fitting instead of the pipe? Because the fitting is what the solder needs to flow into. If you heat the pipe directly, you might get the pipe hot enough to melt solder, but the fitting will still be too cool. The solder will just sit on the outside instead of flowing into the joint. By heating the fitting, you are heating the destination where you want the solder to go. Second, why start from the bottom? 2 reasons. Reason 1 is gravity. Solder is a liquid when it melts, and liquids want to flow downward. If you start heating at the top of the joint, the solder will try to flow down, but the bottom of the joint will still be too cool to accept it. The solder will just drip off and make a mess. But if you start at the bottom, the solder flows down into an area that is already hot enough to keep it liquid and pull it into the joint. Reason 2 is that heat rises when you apply your flame to the bottom of the fitting. That heat naturally travels upward and starts warming the top of the joint. So by the time you work your way around to the top, it is already partially heated. This makes the whole process faster and more even. If you started at the top, the heat would rise away from the joint instead of into it, and you would waste time and fuel trying to get the bottom hot enough. So here's the technique. Light your torch and adjust the flame until you have a nice, steady blue cone. The hottest part of the flame is just at the tip of that inner blue cone. So that is the part you want to aim at your fitting. Position the flame at the bottom of the fitting, right where the pipe enters, and keep it moving in small circles. You do not want to hold it in one spot because that can overheat one area while leaving the rest too cool. Keep the flame moving and slowly work your way around the bottom half of the fitting. After about 10 to 15 seconds of heating, take your solder and touch it to the joint on the opposite side from where your flame is. If the solder does not melt, that is okay. The joint is not hot enough yet. Pull the solder away and keep heating. Test again every few seconds. You will know the joint is ready when the solder instantly melts and gets sucked into the joint like magic. That is capillary action doing its thing. Once you see that solder start to flow, keep feeding it into the joint while moving around the circumference. You want to apply a nice continuous bead all the way around the fitting. For a 1/2 inch joint, you will use roughly 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch of solder. For a 3/4 inch pipe, you will need about an inch of solder. The goal is to see a complete ring of solder visible all the way around the joint where the pipe meets the fitting. That ring tells you the solder has filled the gap completely. One thing I always do is feed the solder into the joint at the bottom first, then work my way up each side and finish at the top. Remember, gravity is working with you when you do it this way. The solder flows down and fills in behind where you have already applied it. If you started at the top, the solder would run down before the bottom was ready to accept it, and you would end up with voids in your joint. Now, here's something really important that a lot of tutorials skip over. Once you have finished soldering, you need to inspect your joint. And I mean, really look at it. A good joint should have a consistent silver ring of solder all the way around, with no gaps, no dull spots, and no areas where you can see copper showing through. If you see any spots that look dry or incomplete, do not panic. This is fixable. Just brush a little more flux onto the problem area. Heat it back up and add a touch more solder to fill in the gap. It happens to everyone, even professionals. The key is catching it now instead of after you turn the water on. Now let us talk about finishing your joint properly, because this step is just as important as everything else we have covered. After you have inspected your solder and you are happy with how it looks, you need to let it cool down. And here is where patience really matters. I know it is tempting to wipe off that excess flux right away, or even hit it with a wet rag to cool it faster. Do not do it. Cooling a joint too quickly can cause something called thermal shock, where the rapid temperature change creates tiny fractures in the solder. Those fractures might not leak right away, but they can fail weeks or months down the road. Just let the joint air cool for 2 to 3 minutes. Once the joint has cooled enough that you can touch the pipe a few inches away without burning yourself, take a dry rag and wipe off any remaining flux residue from around the joint. This is not just about making it look pretty. Leftover flux is acidic, and if you leave it on the pipe, it will slowly eat into the copper over time. I have seen pipes with green corrosion rings around old joints, and that is almost always from flux that was never cleaned off. A quick wipe with a rag takes 5 seconds and protects your work for decades. Let me walk you through some common problems you might run into and exactly how to fix them. Problem number 1 is solder that will not flow into the joint. You are heating and heating, but the solder just balls up on the surface. This almost always means one of two things. Either your joint was not cleaned properly, or you did not use enough flux. The fix is to let everything cool down. Take the joint apart if you can. Re-clean both surfaces until they are bright and shiny. Apply fresh flux and try again. Do not try to force it by adding more heat. That will just burn off the flux and make things worse. Problem number 2 is a joint that looks good but drips when you turn the water on. This usually means there is a void somewhere in the solder, often at the top of the joint where gravity was working against you. To fix this, drain the line, dry the fitting with a rag, apply fresh flux to the leaking area, heat it up, and add a bit more solder right where the drip was coming from. Make sure you get the whole area hot enough for capillary action to pull the solder in. Problem number 3 is solder that looks lumpy or blobby instead of smooth. This happens when the fitting was not hot enough when you applied the solder. The solder melted because it touched hot copper, but it did not flow because the overall temperature was too low. Next time, be more patient with your heating and test with the solder more frequently. You want the fitting hot enough that the solder practically jumps into the joint. Problem number 4 is a greenish or blackened fitting after soldering. This is usually caused by too much flux that got overheated. It is mostly cosmetic and will not affect the seal, but you can clean it up with some emery cloth once everything cools down. To prevent it, use a thinner layer of flux and avoid holding the flame on any one spot for too long. Problem number 5 is a joint that leaks only when the hot water runs. This is a tricky one. It usually means there is a hairline crack from thermal shock, which happened because the joint was cooled too quickly. Unfortunately, the fix here is to cut out the joint completely and start over with a new fitting. It is frustrating, but trying to patch a cracked joint rarely works. The good news is that if you follow the steps we have covered, cleaning thoroughly, using proper flux, heating from the bottom, and letting the joint cool naturally, you will avoid almost all of these problems. Now, for that bonus tip I promised you at the beginning. And this one is really going to give you confidence in your work. Before you close up that wall or turn the water back on for good, do a pressure test on your joint. Here is how. Once your solder has cooled completely, turn the water back on slowly and let the line fill up. Then close the fixture or valve downstream so the pipe is under full pressure with no water flowing. Now watch your joint carefully for at least 2 to 3 minutes. I mean, really watch it. Get your face down there with a flashlight if you need to. A good joint will be completely dry. But sometimes a tiny pinhole leak will not show up immediately. It takes a minute or 2 for that little drip to form. By pressure testing for a full 2 to 3 minutes with no water movement, you are giving any potential leak time to reveal itself. If you see even the smallest bead of water forming, you know you need to fix it now, while everything is still accessible. This simple test has saved me from countless callbacks over the years, and it only takes a few minutes. Far better to catch a problem now than to find a wet ceiling 2 weeks later. So that is everything you need to know about soldering copper pipe for perfect leak-free joints every single time. We covered the tools and materials, the critical preparation steps, proper heating technique, applying the solder correctly, and finishing your joint the right way. If you follow this process, you will get professional results on every single joint you solder. If this video helped you out, I would really appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button and tap the bell icon so you get notified when I post new videos. And if you have any questions about soldering or want to share your own tips, drop them in the comments below. I read every single one, and I am always happy to help. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.